Ladies and gentlemen, we are live from the Isle of Man in the UK. This is John and Mike's MMA Corner.
Right, I'm joined with Karim Zidan. Sir, thank you very much for your time, ladies and gentlemen. This man is the associate editor for BloodyElbow at SB Nation, and he is also a contributor for, I believe, Sports on Earth as well.
Yes, I am. I contribute, but though most of my contributions for Sports on Earth are quite various, really, when it comes to golf, football, and I mean football, not soccer. Like football isn't the soccer that we'd refer to as soccer here in Canada and the United States, and quite a few other sports as well. I'll dabble in some boxing occasionally, and then here and there, when there's something Rousey or McGregor related, they're very interested in that sort of content for a mainstream site like that. But the majority of my MMA work definitely resides on BloodyElbow, which is the site that's brought me up over the past few years.
I was going to say golf and MMA. What a fascinating combination that would be. But
well, people said the same thing to me when I started writing about tennis. Funny enough, I make my living as a journalist, and mostly now off MMA, but the first job I ever got paid for in this business was for tennis, and that was the first sport I actually covered professionally. I mean, I ran my own website for MMA, but the first sport that actually paid me to write about it was tennis, and people used to think that was very odd that I'd write about those two sports, but I never understood what the problem was. I mean, you'd have fighting on one side and finesse on the other one. I didn't understand why I had to be limited to one sport. It was a way for me never to get burnt out of MMA at one time. If I had watched too much MMA, I'd focus a little bit more on tennis, and vice versa. You'd get burnt out after a Grand Slam. You want to watch a good UFC event. So it actually balanced out quite nicely for me, to be honest.
It's a very smart idea. When you put it like that, it is very smart. I should probably do the same. Well, I do the same when the NFL's on, but now I'm stuck. There's no NFL on, so I'm just going to immerse myself in MMA until September.
And if you're watching MMA from around the world, you'll always find something to view.
Yeah, there is always something different. And well, look, you're an editor, and for people who aren't sure what an editor does, I know it sounds silly, but there are people out there who won't know, and it's not their fault. I'm not having to go at anyone. What is your role as an editor then?
Well, I mean, I can understand if people don't necessarily automatically associate editor with something specific in their minds, because I mean, there's so many different roles an editor can have. It depends on the site and how the site is structured, to be honest. Yeah. With BloodyElbow, the way the hierarchy is set up is our editor-in-chief, Nathan Wilcox, is the one who controls the site, and at the very end of the day, he's all of our boss, so everything goes through him at the very end. But below him, there are 5 associate editors. Actually, below him is the managing editor, Anton Tabuena, and then below him are the associate editors, where I lie along with Zane, Simon, Mookie Alexander, Tim Burke. So our jobs vary, and each of us has our own strengths. Like I can, for instance, immediately say that Zane Simon would be the best one when it comes to copy editing and truly restructuring sentence, grammar, whatnot. He loves it. He has a way with words in that regard, and he's very good at looking at a big article and polishing it into something a lot better than the original piece. I use him as my secret weapon for my long forms, to be honest. I'll come to him with a 6,000 word piece, and he'll spend a day or two making me seem a lot smarter than I am, to be honest. So that definitely helps a lot. And there's various roles. Like I like to help some of the writers adjust the direction they're going and picking a theme, for instance, for their article, or how they want to go about writing it, or the sort of language they want to use, how to separate ourselves from a blog and present ourselves more professionally in terms of the writing style, and whether we should copy and paste certain things, whether we should look for our own sources when it comes to certain things. It's just a way to develop fans and amateur writers into slightly more professional writers on a website. I tend to enjoy doing that much more than I do copy editing, for instance. I like to work with I've had to work with people like John Nash when it comes to setting up some of his UFC finance articles, and that's something I enjoy doing tremendously. Sitting back and thinking of, okay, how do we sell this to an audience? How do we take this detailed, complex data and information and present it to an MMA audience that might not necessarily have ever read something this financially complex and detailed. And it's a process, and it goes through several editors. I won't pretend it's just a matter of going through me and that's about it. But when it goes through that process, an article can change dramatically. It can go from notes to a draft, a simple draft, to a more detailed draft, to a perfect article that gets the traffic and gets the recognition it deserves. But sometimes it can go dreadfully wrong. Sometimes we miss things out. Sometimes in that process we forget about the copy editing and we're too focused on structure and how to get traffic from the article and how to word it correctly and the URL and search engine optimization, all these other things that the digital age has brought on for us. So instead you end up forgetting simple things like first sentence of an article, or how to close out an article perfectly, or making silly grammatical errors that should not be there, or forgetting to source something really important. All these things, we're human at the end of the day, so a lot of these errors occur, but I like to think that because we're so many editors now on the site, that there's four of us as associate editors and then the managing editor, that we end up minimizing the damage as much as possible. Like that, if there are cracks, that there are very small cracks that we're able to capture very quickly. And I think that the way the site has progressed over the past couple of years, we've really seen that development since we've taken that structure. There's been more traffic to the website. We've been recognized for our work, at least one of the last 2 years in the MMA Awards, at least for our nomination. And we continue to do that. We continue to develop, get new visitors, new fans. So I think whatever we've done, we're on the right track.
That was so well put. Wow, I love the way that was worded there. Excellent. That is a great description of idea. And you're right, BloodyElbow. I'm loving the work that's coming out of this. You know, I love some of the stuff that you've done. You know, a lot of the stuff. Sorry, I'll rephrase that. Sorry. And you're right, because like you said, you're filtering it. You know, you get an article, you get a piece, and it's going through several people, lot of eyes. It's this simple equation. If a couple more eyes are looking at it, you'll get a different point of view to iron out all the creases, and you know what, it's going so well. I have to say, I loved some of the particular pieces that stood out for me was the Edmund Tavari, his bankruptcy information all came out. You know, the fact that there was the discrepancies in his testimony. You know, some of the stuff is just, you know, the way the time and effort has been spent on it, it's fantastic to read as well.
Well, I appreciate the feedback, and again, it's a team effort. I can truly say that BloodyElbow does not have a superior writer to say, or someone who truly, once you think back, when you used to think of BloodyElbow back in the day, you'd think of Brent Brookhouse leading the way with his work on all sorts of rape charges and accusations. You think of all the stories that he investigated over those years, and you think BloodyElbow was synonymous with him back in the day. It's changed a lot more recently. You find that we have just way too many talented writers, each who have just found their perfect niche, and they're working through with that niche. We have so many. I mean, if I tried to create a list right now, we'd go on forever, because I think I could name every single writer we have and present something that they're better at than someone else on the site. So it really is a team effort. It truly, truly is a team effort. Some of us are better feature writers. Like, I'd like to focus my time on the long forms. There might not be a better person to get interviews and to get the right sort of content out of, and write quotes out of someone than Steph Haynes, sorry. And there's just so much good work. Think of Mookie Alexander and the work he just put out on Cody East and whatnot. It's just, and then John Nash and Paul Giff, they deserve the Journalist of the Year award, in my personal opinion, just for their joint efforts in things like the UFC lawsuit that's ongoing again, like you mentioned, the Edmund Tarverdyan story. And there's just so much good work, and it's varied. The beauty of the site is that we're not necessarily stuck to one sort of style. It's not a site that you're going to just go and look and check out feature work, or it's not a site that's just going to have investigative work or the latest news. I like to think that we focused our effort, instead of finding the right sources to give us fight announcements a day or two before other websites, we focused our energy on the right things that few other websites really truly dare to cover.
You're right. I was going to say dare to cover is a great way to put it, because some of the stuff you put out, I'm sure, obviously, for example, let's say the UFC lawsuit, or the the World Series of Fighting segments he'd done, or Titan FC when the event was cancelled. There's various things that certain promotions or people would rather didn't go out. They would rather that information didn't go out there. You're not going out there to, necessarily shoot down anyone. You're just putting factual information out for people to find out, because like you say, a lot of sites, they'll care about the latest fight announcement, or they'll talk about the latest fight card coming up, but they won't address maybe the ongoings outside of the cage, which I think does matter. And I think if we can address some of these issues, I think it's a big part that should happen. I think a lot of promoters aren't really taking responsibility for some things that happen in MMA.
There's a misunderstanding of what everyone's role is in the MMA community. For some reason, promoters and fans and whatnot think that reporters are part of the same team in some way, that we're all in this together. Maybe because MMA was such a small sport and such an underdog for so long that everyone felt the need to come to its defense as a group just to keep it alive.
Yeah.
But there was no reason for that past 2005, really, when the UFC took over, really came by storm in North America, and then it rose to become a legitimate sport. From then on, you should have really separated, church and state, let's put it that way for at least, but journalism is not PR. For the last time, I don't know why promoters and fans seem to think that we have to be on the same side, or that we're looking out for the good of the industry or the good of the promotion. I have no interest in the UFC's survival or its demise, or Bellator's survival, its demise, its problems, its ongoing scandals. They don't affect me personally. They don't. The way I put out the story is not impacted on whether... the last thing I concern myself with is this going to harm or improve the MMA industry? In what way? Is this going to harm the UFC? What if the UFC goes away because of this? What if this promotion goes away because of this? I can think of a small example. When I started with BloodyElbow, I started a series called the MMA Diaries, where I would, in my own narrative, I would go around, whether I traveled the world or I traveled through different events, and the way I would recap the night, I'd recap it through my eyes and what I saw that night. I attended an event in Ontario that was really, really disappointing, called Substance Cage Combat, and it was the second one and the last one, mind you, that they ever hosted. And my takeaway was that this was abysmal, and that this was the result of how bad the Ontario Athletic Commission had handled MMA over the past few years. Basically, any time after UFC 129. Well, the original article went out, and the promoter took to Twitter and decided to bash me on Twitter. I did not respond once, but he spent about an hour of his time compiling something like 20 tweets against me. And so I thought my first reaction was to ignore this. Then I decided, why ignore this? I'll highlight the article and offer a response directly on BloodyElbow. And my response was very simple, that I don't work for it. I don't work for him. I don't need to write an article pretending that this was a good event just to keep a semblance of MMA alive in Ontario. If MMA is not doing well in Ontario, that's not my responsibility to pretend otherwise, just to keep his promotion around just because he spent some money on an event. That's literally not my concern. That's not the concern of any reporter. A reporter is there to present the facts. If something's hidden, if something's not there, that's what we're there to do. It's research, it's investigation, it's correct sourcing, it's unbiased reporting, as much as humanly possible.
I agree with you fully there. One person who can probably back you up with that was James Lynch. I was speaking with him recently, and we were talking, I think we talked about it off air, really, actually, I'm not sure. But we were talking about Canada and the MMA in general, and he mentioned about the athletic state commissions in certain areas that makes a big impact about why possibly the UFC isn't doing large doing big pay-per-views there still or anything. And you put in an article out, even though it isn't the UFC, it's a regional show, you're still putting the factual information out there, and James put the information out there too, and I don't think that you should be shut down. Especially, I noticed as well, as soon as this Cody East, article went out, which, I read about, and, I've absorbed it, and Mookie is straight away on Twitter explaining and defending what about the article, defend himself about the article. I don't understand why you'd have to, because it's not... The article itself is not a biased article. It's just putting out this simple information out there that the criminal convictions, etc., and that was it. There's nothing saying, it's not condemning Cody in any way. It's just putting out there what had happened in the past.
Well, it's the assumption. It's the assumption that we are against the UFC, or that we are against good MMA, or we're against second chances. I think was one of the tweets I read. Was apparently BloodyElbow is against second chances, because we're seen as the sort of politically correct website in that regard. I guess trying to defend women's rights in some way, shape, or form makes us politically correct. But whatever society has deemed us nowadays is not my concern in terms of a label. But it's the assumption there that you said people get defensive based quickly on the fact that, oh no, BloodyElbow's put another one of their articles out. But the truth is, and what you just said, is that it was an unbiased piece of reporting where we mentioned exactly which his history of his troubling past, basically. And it involves cases where he was acquitted, and they were noted. Another article could have tried to present it as the cases where he was not acquitted from and mentioned just those. Or sorts could have worded it so that this person should never fight in the UFC ever. There was actually no mention of that at all.
No.
None whatsoever. This was not an article saying why Cody East should not fight in the UFC. It was simply mentioning his troubled past. And again, just like Mookie mentioned on Twitter, not reporting that sort of knowledge, if you are aware of it, is irresponsible.
Yes. I do you know what? And this is why I keep retweeting, I keep reposting your articles, because you're doing the right thing, and this is what I don't get. I think you're right. I think people do have that silly mindset that MMA promotions and MMA journalists should be all cuddled up together and, you know, patting each other on the back and, you know, sleeping backhanders together. They are two separate entities, and they should, I say in a way, stay that way, but I understand there should be correspondence between the two, you know, relaying information onto one another, but at the same time there still should be a clear divide between what they are. And I do find that some representations of the MMA journalism, they are very favoritism towards certain promotions or fighters or people, and it grinds me a little bit, because I think you're just doing it basically to be a brown nose.
Well, it's very difficult for me to point a finger in any way, because just being in the industry for a few years, I sort of empathize a lot with everyone involved in whatever position you've decided to fill. And I'll give you an example. Say we're referring to sites that put out too many Conor McGregor articles, and I'll happily mention this right now. We're guilty of that as well, and I'll tell you why. It's traffic.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, we can talk about the fantastic features that come up, and John Nash being able to put out one article a month or whatnot, that's fantastic knowledge that you wouldn't know without his hard work, or Paul Gift's work, or anything, or the long forms that I only get to do about 3 or 4 a year of them. All that would not be possible, and the site would not stay afloat if we didn't have the necessary traffic,
yes,
and the numbers and the viewership, and all that comes from repeated articles on Ronda Rousey, Conor McGregor, Nate Diaz, and it means playing the game to a certain extent. So I won't pretend everyone's innocent or everyone's guilty of something that's only natural for survival. I mean, you have to think about the way media operates nowadays. We are no longer buying newspapers, which automatically funds the organization to print out more newspapers. We have to find a new way to make up for that lost income.
Yeah.
So it comes in the form of ads and more videos on articles, and I know people don't like clicking on articles and finding a video that automatically plays for them, but guess what? It's a way to keep that site that you are addicted to open and running. So what if there are some ads sometime? Occasionally you're going to find sponsored articles and sponsored content on there. If it's not clearly labeled and it's misguiding content, that's a different story. But if it's clearly labeled as a sponsored article or something that's written or presented or paid for by the sponsor themselves, and it's clearly marked, then there should be nothing wrong with it. There should be nothing dreadfully embarrassing about that. Let's put it that way.
Yeah.
There's a certain amount of business that has to be done, and a certain amount of the game that's going to have to be played, no matter what. But it depends to what extent you opt to do that. If you've built yourself as a news site, reporting the basic news and the ongoings for the sport that the average fan is going to want to see, then God bless you. You've done your part, and that's exactly what you want to do. But if you want to go above and beyond, or dig a little deeper, or go in another direction, well, then there's only one way to properly do that. And that involves getting your hands dirty sometimes. And that's the issue. A lot of people don't want to because, well, it'll affect a lot of things. It'll affect your sources. I can confirm right now that there are managers that don't want to speak to BloodyElbow, which means we have a certain segment of the UFC roster that's basically inaccessible to us directly because of these managers who have either been bitten by us or have suffered in some way, shape, or form, or believe that they are going to suffer in some way, shape, or form from interacting with us. And it's always going to be perspective at the end of the day. Someone's going to always say, well, BloodyElbow didn't do this way, didn't do this way. At the end of the day, it could be I've had managers admit that they don't want to deal with us because we covered the Lloyd Irvin situation. So if you're telling me that I should be upset right now that this manager is not in touch with me because Brent Brookhouse wrote about someone as sinister as Lloyd Irvin, yes. I happily say that.
Sinister is a good word to use, yes.
Then I'm not quite sure. I feel like I'm on the wrong side here. Then I'd quite happily not speak to this manager. It does not bother me in the slightest.
Yeah.
The thing is, when you get to this sort of stage with coverage, and you can ask anyone who works for BloodyElbow because they can tell you we're limited in certain things. It's not about being put on a leash, but it's being limited and being basically cut out from a certain segment of the community because we are who we are at this point. It's either something you have to accept and move on with, or you give up and you try and play the game like other websites do. It's a tough one. There's always going to be that tension. But to move back to your earlier point, there's absolutely no reason for you not to have civil relationships with all the promotions you're dealing with. Again, it's not malicious. Yeah. None of this is malicious. We'll happily report good UFC information when it's out there. It's not malicious. It's not an anti-UFC agenda or an anti-Zuffa agenda or anti-Bellator agenda. It's none of that whatsoever. I'll happily report about ACB, M1, global fight nights or whatnot, and I'll happily mention when there's something wrong happening as well. It depends on the news that's available at the time, but it's also a willingness to accept the fact that not everything you're going to publish is going to make someone happy or everyone happy at all times. That's just never, if you're in this industry to make people happy or to make sure that you can still high-five everyone when you go to an event, you are not in the right industry.
Yeah, I agree. I love that. You're spot on with what you're saying there as well. And look, it is a bit of a touchy issue, really, and it can be a tough one to say. Like you say, you don't know which one. If you're going one way, if you're going to get your hands dirty, it is one way. You got to accept things are going to happen. As in, like you say, you can lose contacts. And again, that Lloyd Irving thing. I don't know if you know about it, but he used to he had that almost like a pyramid scheme that he did where he would say do you know how he got his students, and he'd have his students live in a house and he would call them the 1%, and he would have them people just go to competitions and he would constantly win gold medals. And then what happened was everyone who wasn't part of like Lloyd Irving's training, they'd all call themselves the 99%, and they'd go. And they'd all have like little badges saying I'm part of the 99%. And yeah, brilliant it was, absolutely fantastic. I've got a friend of mine who's he went to grappling competitions and saw it and was telling me about it on the keys. So he asked, he went, "What's that all about?" And that was like absolute crack at that. And when I look back at it, I think, yeah, I'm happy I'm part of the 99% as well myself. But look, like you mentioned there, some US based promotions. You yourself do a little bit of commentary with M1. That venture into commentary, how did that come about, and how have you found doing commentary?
How it came about was really, really interesting, actually. I was in Russia on holiday in St. Petersburg. It's been a place I wanted to visit for a very, very long time, and I do not regret that decision. And I had been in touch back and forth with M1 Global on Twitter beforehand, and they knew I was coming over, so they said, well, why don't you come spend a couple of days in our area in St. Petersburg? We've got a show we're putting on. We'll happily, give you all the coverage you want to do, speak to whoever you want and whatnot. Just come and like introduce yourself to us. And I said, well, why not? I don't know that many people in Russia that I'm going to be that busy the whole time. So I do end up making an appearance, and this happened to be the event where Cody McKenzie actually was there, so that added a little flavor to the show as well. It wasn't all just Russians and whatnot, so it was quite an interesting experience. And I think on the second day I was there, I got to speak to Vadim Finkelstein, the infamous Vadim Finkelstein, who used to manage Fedor Emelianenko. And it just surprised me how very different he was to what I'd been told, and the image of Vadim that you think of based on Dana White's impersonations of him for all these years, and the sinister man who didn't allow Fedor to fight for the UFC and whatnot. So it was a very, very, very different person to that entirely. I ended up drinking tea with him and having about an hour-long interview that later went up on Bloody Elbow. But at the very end of the interview, about the last 10 minutes, Daria, who was the PR person, came and sat down right next to Vadim, and they had a quick conversation, and then they turned to me, mentioned my name in Russian, and then they just kept going back and forth, and I started asking, what's going on? So Vadim responds, and he's like, do you like doing commentary? We need a commentator for tomorrow, because Ian Freeman actually was on holiday at the time and wasn't going to be able to attend that show at the end of the year. So without him in the picture, they needed a spare commentator. So they're like, okay, Karim, you seem like you have good English. Would you like to try commentary? And it was going to be me and M1 Global's matchmaker. So I was like, I guess I can do this. And this is interesting, okay. Like, they're like, no, trust me, it's going to be perfectly fine. You're just going to talk about the fights. You seem like you know what you're doing and you have good English. It's going to be perfectly fine. I'm like, okay, sure. And I was expecting to attend this event as a fan and whatnot and relax and lay back, and in the end I found myself sitting in a broadcast booth with headphones on and being told, alright, this button's on, this button mutes this, and this button says this, and you can adjust the volume like this, and you're ready to go. And that was my introduction to commentary right there, nothing else whatsoever. So by the time I came back to Moscow a few months later, they ended up liking the commentary a lot and basically invited me back as soon as possible. I skipped an event in Georgia that I wasn't able to attend, and I was back again in Moscow 3 months later, and this time alongside Ian Freeman. I was thrust right into it. He's basically sat down and he's like, alright, here's how I like to do it. I like to talk about the fights, and you look like you've got a lot of notes, so you add some color to all this. I'm like, sounds good to me. I'm like, fantastic. So we basically got started. Took a little bit to just master how to get around each other so that I'm not speaking over him or interrupting each other. And just about 2 or 3 fights into the prelims, and we felt like we hit a groove. And ever since then, it's been each event we feel like we're getting a little bit than the event before. It's a work in progress always, but I feel like working with such a professional, such an experienced individual like a UFC veteran like Ian Freeman is just fantastic. And sometimes a little starstruck. I'm sitting there, I'm like, wow, I'm trying to keep up with this person here, and he seems to think this is going okay. So. Just five events in, I think I'm enjoying this commentary thing.
That's awesome. That is some story. That they just call you in last minute. That is fantastic. That wow. I have to say that is one way to get about. And do you know what? Like you say, it is a learning curve. The two of you together. It's just got to take time. The more fights you do, the more smooth you'll get, and you'll just like you say. It's like when you hang out with someone for long enough, you can finish each other's sentences.
Well, yeah, it's good because we don't just suddenly meet in the broadcast booth and start talking and don't have conversations before or after. No, we're usually I'm there at the show about a few days early. Ian only shows up about 24 hours before the show. He's usually working at his gym until it's time to head out for the show. So he comes out about 24 hours before, but I'll spend the majority of those 24 hours with him. So we'll have breakfast at the hotel or something of the sorts, or lunch, and we'll be at the show about 3 hours early. So we've got 3 hours where it's mostly Russian people running around setting up the show, and Ian and I just relaxing, shooting the shit, just having a conversation, basically. So by the time we start commentary, we've already had a big, long conversation or very comfortable speaking. So it's almost like a warm-up in a way.
Yeah. No, that sounds great. That does. Now, like I said, you go to Russia. You covered a lot of the Eastern Europe kind of MMA scene, and that's something that doesn't, I say even in the UK, get enough coverage of. And there's a couple of, like, for example, the UFC have stretched out to Zagreb, and they're starting to push out there for that market. They realise that there's talented guys out there. Do you think there's a reason why no one none of the big promotions have maybe reached out that far yet. Do you think there's anything in particular? Maybe it's political or something?
Well, if you're thinking about specifically Russia, then I can tell you that it's the reason is maybe threefold. It'll be political, socially, and economically speaking, really. If you want to take it on all those levels, and I'll break it down for you right now. The problem when you think of the UFC expanding to Russia is they have to think of it as a good business venture on their part as well. They're expanding to ensure either a new fan base entirely, a new broadcast venture, a new deal of some sorts, or something that's going to benefit them in the long term. So they've established a broadcast deal in Russia that they had to renew recently because the network that they established it with shut down. So they just re-established their deal. So you'd want to cement something like that with an event. The problem with setting up an event in Russia right now is the current recession happening in Russia. Yeah. So when I go, and it's easy for me to notice being in Canada, well, actually Canada's suffering right now versus the American dollar, but just traveling back and forth to Russia, I see how the ruble is affected, just basically on a daily basis. So it's been slashed significantly. There's no way that you can put on a show in Russia and expect many fans to attend at UFC prices and actually feel like you're going to profit off that sort of an event. They're not the sort of promotion that will go in and co-promote, which would be the easiest way to actually enter Russia. So when you talk about promotions like Ryzen and Sakakibara's interest in doing an event in Russia, that actually makes a lot of sense. And if you had to ask me which promotion is more likely to put on a show first in Russia, I would say Ryzen is the correct answer. Why? Because they'd be willing to associate themselves with either the Russian Union of MMA, which is with the union that Fedor is president of. So if they associate themselves with that, which is a union that has officials and judges and a host of amateur fighters and all sorts of things, they end up with a venue, judges, officials, and prelim fighters all set up for them before they even step on Russian soil. So it makes a big difference. Or if you associate yourself with, say, M1 Global or ACB or Ahmed MMA, any of the Chechen promotions, you end up with a foundation that's already laid out for you, something you can't just go in as a foreigner and do in Russia. It doesn't operate that way. It's not an easy place. First of all, it's not a place where English is commonly spoken. English is spoken by people who went to schools, either private schools or foreign language schools that had English in the first place. Other than that, government or state-sponsored English programs were next to nothing. So generally, you'll have people with just the very, very, very basic English, and there's no English signs anywhere. The system operates differently. People are very different in Russia. The expectations for people is different. M1, you have a whole section taped off where there's a lot of celebrities that attend, and a lot of actors and stars and like Olympic champions and whatnot, and then there's businessmen on one side. There's a lot of people who are basically attending on a free ticket, comped prices. So the UFC is going to have to learn that there's a lot of you scratch my back, I scratch your back when it comes to a place like Russia. And whilst I understand that they've gone in and operated in many different countries, Russia's a very different place. And if there's under the Putin administration, if you're not operating under the business ventures with the oligarchs or with Russian businessmen who already are in favor with Putin in either St. Petersburg or Moscow, you're not going to put on a successful event. You're not even going to promote it well enough to get enough fans there. Why? Because the UFC is on very, very late at night in Russia. Not a lot of people watch the UFC. Based on the ratings that I've seen when I was in Russia, many more people watch M1 Global and Fight Nights at regular scheduled times in Russia than they'd stay up to watch the UFC. So that's why when they had to redo their deal recently, they struggled to get the right price that they wanted, because it was a losing venture for Match TV, which is the Russian broadcasting company that bought the rights to the UFC. It was not an essential get for them. It wasn't. So the UFC is already struggling as an entity in Russia. Whether they succeed or not, people will watch big fights. People will watch Conor McGregor. It's all everyone's talking about in Russia right now, comparing Conor McGregor to the Russian fighters and whatnot. People will always watch a star. People will go out of their way to watch a star. But Russia's a place where copyright doesn't apply the same way at all. So there's always videos of all the events and all these YouTube clips of all the fights, all the UFC fights, always posted everywhere. So just for them to profit off a place like Russia is going to be very difficult. I think it is the most difficult country they're going to try and venture into in the next few years. By no way, shape, or form can I imagine another country that's going to be more difficult than Russia.
Because I was going to say, because Bellator, you know, they it seemed they invested, especially in the Bjorn kind of reign, let's say, he invested into a few Russian fighters, and I thought that there might have been a venture to Russia at some point, because it seemed like he was putting an invested time looking at these kind of Russian fighters coming onto the promotion, but nothing ever came through, and Bellator now are looking to do the tour in Europe, Scott Coker, and then obviously, you know, sadly, Shalemenko, you know, failed test, etc., and he went to M1, but I thought that was going to happen, but it never came through, really.
A lot of the reasons that I mentioned apply to Bellator as well.
Yeah.
Except the fact that during the Bjorn Rebny era, Russia had not hit the recession yet, so they were actually a lot more likely to go then than they are now.
Yeah, because I heard I think it's like down 50% in the last couple of years. It's the value of it.
Yes, indeed. It's between the sanctions and between the wars that they're involved in, and I mean we can go on the list of things going on in Russia right now. It's just a very volatile country for you to try to go into. I mean, unless the UFC is in the business of losing money, this is not the place that they want to go to right now. It really isn't. I mean, promotions like M1 and Fight Nights and whatnot are surviving right now because, first of all, they're offering the correct prices, and they're established companies in the country. So, for instance, the show that I was just at, and I just did commentary for, was M1 Challenge 64, which was headlined by Alexander Shlemenko versus Vyacheslav Vasilevsky. And it had Alexander Volkov on the card and whatnot. I know that M1's budget had increased significantly just because of the currency that they're paying their fighters in, be it euros, be it dollars, versus the ruble. That's just an easy assumption to make based off the recession. But the fact of the matter is they sold many more seats now than any other event I saw myself that I was at for an M1 show, because of the fight card that they had and because they had put the right effort into promoting it and going about it at the right time and offering the correct prices. There was a lot of research involved into this most recent event, and they ended up with a 7,000 seat crowd instead of 2,000 or 3,000 like they had done in the past two shows in St. Petersburg. So it makes a big difference when you apply it correctly. Now, the UFC is not even aware of all this, and if M1 can go about making mistakes every other event for the past year, is the UFC going to... How costly would the UFC's mistake be if they go into their first venture and they screw it up immediately?
Yes, especially if it did 2,000, it would just be a mess. It would be terrible for them, especially, you know, if you had the cameras on there and it's just empty seats. But then the question for me then with Russia would be, is then MMA kind of volatile as in the sense of could M1 maybe have to stop doing as many shows? Could you see a decline in MMA in Russia due to the recession? Obviously not due to the lack of talent, because there is talented fighters out there, which is what's so frustrating.
Actually, I would say the opposite, and for two reasons. And they're split into ethnic Russia and Chechnya. Now let's start with ethnic Russia, which basically has the two big promotions being M1 Global, the biggest in Russia, and Fight Nights. So both of them have acquired new sponsors, or actually let's not call them sponsors, new investors recently. Very significant investors in the Russian market in general, whether it be infrastructure, steel, without getting into specifics, each of those companies acquired significant investors that will help with the finances during hard times. So I don't think they'll necessarily be in a lot of trouble as long as they can continue to pull off events like they're pulling off right now. These past two events, Fight Nights just put on an event in Moscow, and so did M1 Global, both very successful shows. If they can continue to do that, they should be in minimal trouble considering the circumstances. Now, on the other hand, we've got Absolute Combat Berkut and Championship Berkut and Ahmed MMA, both of which are in Chechnya. One of them is funded by the Chechen leader Ramzan Kadyrov. Now, that's a very, very, very controversial figure. very controversial figure, many human rights allegations and accusations levied against him over the years, significant figure in many regards. He brought Chechnya out of its war-torn past with Russia and created a sort of a fiefdom, an Islamic fiefdom that he rules and occupies right now, quite happily and with pretty much the respect of most of the people involved in the country, whether by fear or by just simply creating a better environment of living. I mean, he has improved the standards of living generally. It's very hard to deny that much, but it's also hard to deny the past he has and he brings with him. I mean, a guerrilla fighter once upon a time, and I implore most people to really truly go search him up on Google rather than hear me talk about him, and you'll get all your information and you can come to your own decisions about this human being. But at the end of the day, he's an MMA hobbyist, and he has chosen MMA as the outlet that he's going to fund and create athletes. So Ahmed MMA was his project that he started a few years ago, basically entirely funded by him. They now have a 1,000 square meter gym, something along that lines, that is insane, and has just been built. It's got all these screens everywhere, state-of-the-art facility, training facility. They've got, I think, about 10,000 amateurs training right now, trying to be fighters. He funds a lot of these fighters. I mean, he is Tyrone Spong training in his gym right now for a fight. What? He regularly brings people in like Badr Hari. Oh no, this is I mean it. He's someone who truly has invested into this sport. I mean, this is a man who had Frank Mir and Frankie Edgar and Chris Weidman dancing at one of his parties, dancing the Lezginka, which is a traditional North Caucasus dance. You can check out either my work on the subject. You'll find quite a bit of it on either Sports on Earth or Bloody Elbow, or you can check out Patrick Wyman's fantastic work on Chechnya and Ramzan Kadyrov as well, whether it be for Deadspin or for Bleacher Report. So it's all there and it's all available for people to read if they're interested in it. So he, in the end of the day, has he will not exhaust his fund anytime soon. So that promotion has just is about to put on a Grand Prix of sorts that includes a lot of interesting fighters. Like they've brought Fedor Khazbulayev back. They've got Magomed Biblatov, who's the current flyweight champion in the World Series of Fighting. They've got Kurt Holloway, and they're bringing in Tyrone Spong. They've got all sorts of people that they're happily paying for, and they've got the money to pay for. There's almost no promotion in Russia right now that will have more money than him. Unfair, yes, but there's no promotion that is better suited for the task right now. Whether they survive in the long run is a different story, and that will have to do with the politics of the situation. ACB is another one in Chechnya that is very well funded by businessmen, and they'll be completely fine for the next while. So I think Russia in itself, they're solid because of the investors that they have.
That's kind of reassuring though to hear that it's safe, because my worry is, like say, a recession hits a country and it does have a knock-on effect on everything. In MMA, I was speaking with a couple of guests on it about actually Jeremy Klump. I've had James Lynch, a handful of people on there and even Chuck Mindenhall as well, and we spoke about how the MMA bubble is actually a lot smaller than you realise. You know how I might think that MMA is. Everyone knows about MMA. Everyone knows MMA. That's it. Everyone knows, but no, they really don't. It's not as big as I make out. So, when a country has a recession, when it has a knock-on effect on everything, because MMA is not so big, it will have a larger knock on it than I actually realise. So that's my worry with, for example, Eastern European countries, that, especially with the EU and especially in certain countries that are part of the Euro, where the Euro's not so strong, it does worry me a little bit, and because I want to see the sport grow. You know, I completely endorse the sport and help. I will do anything to help it grow. But seeing how these investors in Russia are there to help it's huge, and I suppose in a way it does kind of fill me with the kind of hope that in the future everyone just won't be looking at UFC, because this was one thing that gripes me is people only know the UFC, and I think there's so many other promotions out there that put on amazing fights and have some really talented fighters. Just because they're not in the UFC doesn't mean these guys are not of that caliber.
It's a difficult subject all around. It's like, how can you ever convince one person who's a casual fan to watch that much of a certain sport that he's only a casual fan of.
Yes.
At the end of the day, the UFC is where it is because of its consistency, because of its ability, because of the way it penetrated the market at a specific time, and the way it's lasted over the past few years, whether it be with investors, whether it be with its evolution and whatnot. At the end of the day, it was right place, right time, and then it evolved from there. But it's essential that the UFC be exactly what people view the most, because on any one day you could end up with a promotion like Bellator putting on a show like Kimbo Slice versus Dara 5000, and if that was our Vatican for MMA, then we're in then our belief system is in a lot of trouble, isn't it? So at the end of the day, if you're gonna have to pick one thing, that's why there's only one FIFA. There's only one NFL. There's only one. You know what I mean? And that's the UFC is gonna have to fill that role. If you're that hardcore fan, then by all means go watch all the other sports, because there's enough of a void there to be filled, and there's enough stuff for your viewing pleasure out there. But it's important that the UFC be the main thing that people focus on, because it's the most successful. And as long as it's the most successful entity, MMA stays alive. MMA stays alive as long as the UFC stays alive. Everything else that you want to view on the side is fantastic and well and good, because you go, just as I mentioned, you go to places like Russia, and M1 Global and Fight Nights are bigger promotions there than the UFC is. That's important.
Yes.
That's important for their existence. But those are established entities. M1 Global is 18 years old. 18 years old. That's longer than Zuffa's had the UFC. So it's again an established entity. That's the only way you're going to survive in a market like this, with a sport that's already a niche sport. It's regulated violence. And I'm not here for the distinction between whether it's violence or sport. At the end of the day, it's a somewhat violent sport.
Combat sport.
So it's never going to be for it's never going to be for everyone.
Yeah.
It's never going to be for everyone. It's like boxing. As much as boxing can be popular, or your grandfather watched it or whatnot, it is still a violent sport.
Yeah.
It's not tennis. It's not tennis. It's not basketball.
Yeah.
It's never going to be FIFA. It's never going to be the World Cup.
No, it's not.
But as long as there are certain countries out there, think of KSW. We haven't even mentioned KSW and how successful they are in Poland, and how much of a sensation someone like Mamet Khalidov and Mariusz Pudzianowski are in Poland, how important they are to the community there, and how much the Polish fans prefer an event like a KSW show than a UFC show like the ones that went to Poland. It's important that all these other promotions be there. But when fans tell me that, I just know UFC or I just watch UFC, that doesn't bother me in the slightest. It's to be expected. And as long as that still exists, that people at the very least tell you they watch the UFC, you know the sport's at least at a healthy stage right now.
It is. Now, you mentioned FIFA there, and FIFA are a governing body, and it's something that has been simmering on the MMA scene for a while now. People talking about an MMA governing body. I put it out there before as well. Do you think it will actually happen? Like one kind of ruling entity for the world of MMA, and if it were to happen, do you think the knock-on effects could kind of damage some of the promotions? Maybe. It's a tough one. I know. I'm trying to say hypothetically. Let's just like think hypothetically. For example, you've got ONE FC. They allow soccer kicks, okay? But this kind of like let's say FIFA came along, they wouldn't allow soccer kicks. So that would take away that niche market that ONE FC offer of having head kicks in. Or, for example, the M1 and Risen, they like to use the ring. They said, no, we're using cages because it's safer, no one could fall out, etc., blah, blah, blah. Do you feel that it could, like those kind of little effects? Because I think each promotion, not every promotion, sorry, but some promotions have their own little niche market in what they offer.
Sorry to interrupt.
No, go ahead.
I think there's I'm not quite sure that it's ever possible, because of the reasons you just mentioned, that it's ever going to be possible for a body, a sort of a world organization to control a sport globally like that. I don't think it's ever going to be possible, because, and again, separated in many different ways. The UFC at the end of the day has to answer to athletic commissions, which is basically a part of the government. So. Yeah. That's going to happen in the United States, but then again, what happens in Canada is slightly different. What happens in the UK, I'm sure, is very different.
Yeah.
What happens in Russia is very different. Now, to get all those to associate together, how's that even possible? If once it is possible, or once it is achieved, I'm not quite sure that would ever be a good thing in any way, shape, or form.
Yeah.
The beauty, why I watch these, people always ask me why I spend so much time on KSW and M1 and Fight Nights and ACB. It's because they're so different.
Yes.
They're so different. I just put out a tweet recently, like just an hour ago or so, saying that what I like about the Russian regional scene is each of those promotions are so different in terms of the crowds that show up, in terms of the production value, in terms of the entrances. Some come out with dances, some have military ensembles coming out like their version of like the Star Spangled Banner. It's and all sorts of other hilarious parody things that come out. You had people coming out as Cinderella at some point, or Anastasia, and it's just entertainment on a different level.
Yeah.
And it's the same. It's the reason why people are so nostalgic about Japanese MMA, and why so many people enjoyed Ryzen when the show happened on New Year's Eve. There's a lot of people who did enjoy it, even though it had things like Bob Sapp and Akebono on it. Even though, despite all those things, people still enjoyed the differences that you find, these little unique touches that happen in all these other MMA shows. It's part of what makes MMA special. MMA, as much as the UFC and as much as Dana White will try so hard to ensure that this is nothing but a sport, at the end of the day, this will always be sports entertainment. It'll be so much closer to the WWE that anybody who's a hardcore MMA fan will be comfortable admitting.
Do you know what? You're right. When Risen came, I loved it. Yeah, Bob Sapp bit, I wasn't super happy. But the fact, actually, I'll tell a lie, I actually enjoyed seeing Bob Sapp because he actually fought back. He fought back in that fight.
He did.
That was why I literally could not believe my eyes. I thought, hang on a minute, why is he throwing a punch? Usually he's lying down now, grabbing something, pretending he's hurt. I couldn't believe he was fighting back. The saddest bit, the whole thing, I think even you'll admit, was the Sakuraba bit. That was...
Oh, that should never have happened. I agree.
Exactly.
That put a damper on the whole thing.
Yeah.
I agree 100%. I don't accept any of those things happening. And the saddest thing is, apparently, it's not done for Sakuraba. Apparently, he's going to be fighting again.
Yeah.
I hope it's just I hope it's just some sort of exhibition thing and not something.
I would like it to be grappling.
Putting him up against Aoki, really?
I'd like it to be a grappling. I wouldn't mind him if he just did grappling.
I agree. Sakuraba's fun to watch, and his entrances are great, and the crowd clearly loves him.
Yeah.
But my God, please, let's not have him die in the ring.
Unless
please.
It's Hoist Gracie or Ken Shamrock, I don't want to see it.
I don't even want to see them involved in anything anymore. That Bellator show had me so uncomfortable I couldn't even watch it. Well, other than the fact that I was in Moscow at the time, I still had no interest. Like, I came back from that M1 show, and usually we're all bubbly, and there's an after party that happens and whatnot afterwards, and you're drinking, you're up late.
Yeah.
I could have easily tuned into that show, and I chose to sleep rather than tune into that horrible show. I don't regret it in the slightest.
I didn't watch it either. I literally woke up the next day and looked at my phone and went, what's the results? There we are. That's good to know. And I thought, actually, I saw TKO and I thought, well, I've got to see how that was a TKO because I don't know how that happened. And that's how I know how it finished. But obviously, I had to watch that bit. I was thinking, Hoist with a TKO. I was like, that's interesting. I thought it'd be... I never thought that. Out of all the options of the way it would go down, I never thought that one. But... Okay.
Yeah, the first knockout of his career or something like that.
Yeah, and it was not even that. It was just embarrassing, to be fair. But
the whole thing was an embarrassment.
Yeah. Do you know what the sad thing is, though? It drew in 2.3 million viewers.
Good for Spike. That's what they're in. That's what they're in this for. Because at the end of the day, Bellator could put on these amazing fights that hardcore fans love and whatnot. But if they don't bring in ratings, then the promotion is more likely to die. Spike's in this for the ratings. Viacom in particular, with their crashing numbers right now, they're in it for the ratings.
Yeah.
So it's important that they pull off numbers like that if people want Bellator to stick around. To me, I'm not concerned. The problem is getting people to trust the promotion and tune in again after what they saw that time. It's one thing for 3 million people to peak watching the Kimbo Slice fight. It's another thing for you to convince those 3 million people that they did not just burn their eyesight or drop a few IQ points watching that, and it's worth trying again. Yeah,
because you can't keep finding a new 2.3 million, a new lot of people, a new lot of eyes every time. It is a dangerous one. Okay, well, we said it's near enough impossible for a FIFA, but there is that fighters union that keeps getting spouted about as well. Do you think that's something that will come along, because you got the UFC, for example. Their EA, they've released the roster for the game, the UFC game, and Benson Henderson is on the game, yet he's not with the promotion. Now, is that because of his contract signed with them beforehand, where they might have his likeness for an extended period of time? That I don't know how that works, but do you think something like the Fighters Union will come about? And if it does, do you feel that it might have a good thing? It might be a good thing for MMA. It might not be. Hypothetically, again, it's just
It was difficult to speak on the Benson Henderson case just because we don't know what the contract states. But you'd have to assume the UFC had full control of using his likeness for the EA game without paying him, mind you, and that the game, just because it was released now, it was probably something that was dealt with and brought up, that came about in the first place when he was still in fighting for the UFC. So I don't know if that's something we want to focus on too much, but to take it to this really important point about the Fighters Union, it's essential. It's absolutely essential, and it's going to have to happen at some point, whether people believe it is or it isn't. There was once upon a time where all our favorite beloved sports now did not have unions and did not have associations at the very least. Now, a lot of them, we refer to them by the association. We think of the ATP in tennis. That's the Association of Tennis Professionals. That's the men's association that was created in the 90s that changed the way the tennis tour was structured, changed the way purses were handed out in tournaments, that changed the way changed everything, basically. It changed how much money was split between the tournament and the players, and what rights they had to their things, and what they were allowed to do and what they weren't allowed to do. Everything changed when the players actually had a say, and it involved a lot of, it was not easy. It was very difficult, and it changed multiple times. I've written a series of articles on BloodyElbow actually that deal with what happened in tennis and how MMA could basically learn from it when it comes to a fighters association, because it didn't just happen for the men, it happened for the women as well. There's a reason why Billie Jean King is hailed as one of the greatest sportspersons of all time, is because of her involvement in many things, not just the battle of the sexes, but without her, the Women's Tennis Association would never have been formed. It was formed by her. It was formed by her because of the discrepancy in pay between men and women in tennis. And they changed that. If there's a sport now where women thrive in the most, it's tennis.
Yes.
It is tennis. And there's no way you're ever going to get to that answer without an association. It's just never going to happen. A business is never going to hand over its profits to you for the sake of it, for morality's sake. Never. Don't expect that. That would be ignorant, naive, and you deserve what you get if you start thinking like that. It's never going to happen. Without banding together, without the concept of collective bargaining, you're hopeless. You're hopeless. It happens in the NBA all the time. It happened in football. It happened in all sports. It is bound to happen one day in MMA. Even though MMA is an individual, people talk about MMA being an individual sport and not a team sport. Well, tennis is an individual sport. It's an individual sport, yet there are now, the ATP now has executive committees that every year has a different player representation assigned to it, and they come up with different ideals and different policies that they want to implement. And when they have a discussion, if a player says a gay slur, for instance, in an event, if they deal with how he should be punished, it's not just suddenly the association coming out with an answer. There are stages you go through, and it's a hierarchy and a process. It's no longer Dana White, whether he's angry one day or isn't angry one day, showing favoritism one way or another. It's a process done professionally, and one day, whether the UFC likes it or not, they're going to have to play the game. It's just going to happen. But when it happens, is a different story.
Yes. Well, one man that keeps sticking out there, the idea of it and talking about, is John Fitch. He's very much adamant about that Fighters Union and all this, and he's a smart man as well. And I'd be interested to see if he kind of when he retires is when he'll be more proactive in making it happen. I think at the moment, while he's still training, prepping for fights, I think that time that he's spending doing that, when he retires, I think it's something that I think he certainly could be the spearhead for this. You know, he's very adamant in it and very proactive in getting his voice out there about it.
Retired fighters will be far less significant and pivotal to the process of an association than active professionals, particularly at the top of their game, would be. There's just, if you're ever going to convince the active roster that has something to lose to get on board, then you also have to show that you have something to lose and that you've joined the fight with them the same way. You've got to put in your chips as well. If you're asking someone to go all in, why are you not going all in? It's got to go both ways. And when a fighter's retired, he's done his part and he's done. I don't think they're as significant. People coming out now with all these ex-UFC fighters, and the UFC lawsuit, I truly hope it goes through, and I truly hope it works. And the UFC lawsuit is an entirely different game than setting up an association. Whilst the two can be related in certain parts, indirectly, it is not the same concept. So for ex-UFC fighters to deal with the UFC lawsuit is a different process entirely than asking for an association that has current, active UFC fighters on board. That's a big step. That's a way to gain the confidence of other people on the roster who are previously too worried to risk their jobs. Understandably so.
Yeah.
Understandably so. It's the biggest organization and it's a risk. Indeed it is. And you never know if it's going to work or if it's going to work in your time even. A lot of people who got involved in this in tennis got involved and they never managed to reap the rewards because it came well after their time. People now like Roger Federer and Novak Djokovic and whatnot, they get to reap the millions that come in from the deals that were placed by the people that came far before them. And that might be the problem. There's going to have to be a sort of a sacrificial lamb that's involved here. And no one wants to play that role right now. And until someone does, collective bargaining will never happen. Until someone does, people like Nate Diaz will get paid 20 and 20. I understand that has changed with UFC 196. But up until then, just because of a bad manager and a certain issues with the UFC, he ended up being one of the most experienced lightweights on the roster and was making an abysmal 20 to show, 20 to win. That is pathetic. That would never happen with collective bargaining. Would never happen.
Yeah.
There would be different minimums. There would be mandatory minimums to be met at different UFC fights. There would be so many things that the UFC could not go about just for the sake of proving a point or placing someone in their place or putting someone in their place. It's just never going to happen that way. And Aljamain Sterling would never have had to struggle so much to get a deal that he believes he is worth. One of a possible future bantamweight champion struggling to get a proper deal for the UFC, unheard of. It should never happen.
Yeah, you're
but it's
right.
going to continue to happen until collective bargaining. As the issue, people think it's a matter of them and their individuality and their branding. It's not just about that. That is if you're the 1%. What about the rest of you? What about the rest of you? The rest of you want to make a good amount of money as well. You're punching yourselves in the head. You're losing brain cells. You're suffering like irreparable damage to yourself.
Yes.
Whether it be like people don't even account for all the different things you're going to be in hospital for when you're 60 and 70, the operations you'll have to take and hip replacements and whatnot, things that the UFC will never fund for you then. But guess what? If you had collective bargaining, you could have had a contract that could have changed all of that.
Yes, well, in fact, think about it. You don't have to even be in your 60s. Mark Coleman, he had to get his hips done. And he set up a GoFundMe account, and Mark Hunt donated $5,000 towards it.
Exactly. Imagine you had to go. It's almost, for lack of a better way of putting it, really almost begging.
Yeah.
To get something. It's not right.
And he
it's
literally
not correct. There should be a player's pension, just like there's player's pension. There should be a player's fund left over, and the UFC should be held liable for a lot of these things.
Well, you got to think
they're not going to until pressured.
And I think Coleman's a good example in a sense of he was. For example, a Hall of Fame, just a legend of the sport. Let's put it this way: the godfather of ground and pound, etc. He was on the Tough series with Penn and Edgar, and he was on Team Penn, and it was literally about 6 months after that show or whatever, how extended period of time it was, when he had this operation, had to basically ask for the money. And you think he was literally just on with helping guys out to get in the UFC, and you think it was only about $50,000 he needed, I think, off the top of my head. I can't remember roughly how much it was because it was not just the operation, it was the rehab afterwards. And you thought, Dana White, he probably blows his nose with $50,000 bills. You know, it's, come on, what is going on here? And you think, like you say, if there was a contract in place for when you retire, you can get medical treatment, maybe the UFC, kind of helps out with it. Maybe they're not saying they pay for everything, but they maybe take a brunt of the money, stuff like that. It would be something that will happen. The NFL, look, the NFL have those, I'm not sure what they're called. Is it walkouts or something? I'm going to figure out what it's called now. Before the season starts,
I wouldn't know.
Yeah, there's always talk about if the season's going to start because all the player unions, players join
exactly.
the
Well, the NBA had one as well, basically, and it's just the ability to have something like that where you know the players will unite for a certain cause.
Yes.
And there's a lot of causes that, when you think about the fact that the WWE wrestlers have more rights than UFC fighters, it really makes you wonder what it means to be a part of a professional sport versus part of sports entertainment.
Yeah, and you got to think there's imagine 500 and, what is it, 550 people, I think it is, I forget how many UFC have got signed, 550 fighters standing all together as one. That's a powerful number, that's a powerful figure to have.
Indeed, and that's a figure that would be very, very costly to the UFC as well. So, and they know this, so they're playing their cards correctly for their part, from their perspective.
Yeah,
you can't fault the UFC for trying to profit as much as possible.
Oh,
you just simply can't fault them for that. It's not their fault. Blame the fighters for not collectively associating themselves together at this point. Honestly, at the end of the day, it sounds harsh, but it's the truth of the matter. They're the only ones who can be out there for themselves, and if they don't come out and protect themselves, no one else can. There's only so much you can rely on the media. You can rely on the media to do things like what we're doing right now, coming onto radio shows and preaching these topics and talking about them and talking about their importance and writing about them and investigating and doing our part. But at the end of the day, we don't work for them, just like we don't work for the promotions.
Yes.
we don't work for either side, and whether they succeed or don't succeed, at the end of the day, it's no skin off my back.
Right. But no, it isn't. No, absolutely.
Move forward correctly. It'll be that's all we want to see. We want to see this move in the trajectory that professional sports tend to move in, and this is just another layer to the legitimacy process of MMA.
Exactly, and that's what I mean. It'll add legitimacy. It will make it look a lot more professional, and I think it would probably encourage more people to be participating in the sport more, knowing that they've. I say call it a safety net. If you have stuff like a fighters union, so that if things do happen, you've got that kind of people to look after you, and I think it makes a difference. But look, we'll forget about the imaginary things that are going to happen. I'm going to ask you, can you give us 5? Go on, we'll try and narrow it down then, all right? If you can narrow it to 5, if you can't, it's fine to name out more. 5 fighters that you've been watching on the kind of Eastern European MMA scene that we should maybe YouTube, look into, follow a bit more, and pay a bit more interest in.
That's a very, very interesting question. There's quite a few of them, and what disappoints me, that a few of them lost recently. So hopefully they can avenge that over the next while. One of my personal favorites has always been Musa Khamanaev. He's a featherweight fighter. He's a Chechen featherweight fighter who's fantastic. He lost his fight at Titan FC, but other than that, he was a fantastic fighter. I think he won his most recent one as well. One to watch out for, in my opinion. Another one is a 19-year-old who I actually called in my first commentary gig. I called one of his fights for M1 Global. His name is Yusuf Furaisov, also a Chechen. He took over Adlan Amagov's his nickname, the Boar's nickname, which is actually Wolf in Chechen. So it's quite an honor to have that name passed on to him by Amagov. Amagov basically believes in him very much. So a really talented 19-year-old kid who just looks he's just so experienced and so wise for his age. It's very, very impressive to watch. He's managed and funded by the ACB team, and they look after him very well. They see him as their prize possession, basically, in terms of prospects. So he's definitely one to watch out for. You'll find him on the ACB shows. It's very difficult to think of who else that you really want to watch out for. There's M1 Global has a fantastic bantamweight who actually put on a great fight recently. His name is Pavel Vitruk. It's a fantastic talent as well that you want to watch out for. Hussein Khaliv is another Chechen featherweight that's really talented. He's actually the younger brother of Adam Khaliv, who was signed to the UFC a couple of years ago, a middleweight with fantastic spinning kicks, but actually has not debuted yet. So those two fighters I'd add to my list as well, Adam Khaliv and Hussein Khaliv, and those are the 5 fighters I'd say you check out. And notice 4 of those fighters are Chechen fighters.
Hey, do you know what? That's my weekend now filled up. Thank you for that. No, it's something. You know what? This is what I mean. I'm writing. Honestly, I've been writing notes as we've been conversing because it's more a lesson for me as well as everyone listening. Because like we said before, people, a lot of the traffic you see online is UFC, and I literally I want people to learn about everything, every angle of the sport, and every kind of... There's fighters out there who I think deserve the attention. I can't get these guys on because I don't speak very good Russian, so I can't get them on. But the thing is, if I can get the name out there, that's something. That's something. That's... At least
it certainly is.
And it doesn't sound a lot, but for me, it makes me feel a little bit better inside. Now, I'm not going to keep you here forever because I could literally, I'm not even lying, speak about MMA for a lifetime. I love it. I'm terrible for it. I've had people on before where I said, we'll be on for 15, 20 minutes, and I've had them on for a lot longer. I had Brad Pickett. I remember when we got Brad Pickett on the first time, and we said, we'll be about 20 minutes, mate. 1 hour later, and we're just still talking to him. He doesn't mind. He's a great guy, Brad. But it's one of those things. Look, I'm probably going to get you back on in the future because I really enjoyed talking to you and finding out information. You're just dropping a lot of information bombs here. But before...
Well, yeah, I happily do it because that's the thing, right? When it comes to covering a segment of MMA that a lot of people don't really focus on too much, I end up with a lot of knowledge that actually will interest people. They just don't really think about it. They don't know that they want to know it yet. But believe it or not, since I started covering the Russian side, and I already thought it was going to be more of a hobby on my part, I ended up with a big portion of like the Russian MMA fan base actually following me now and being like, look, we have a foreign reporter who's actually learning Russian. He's trying to actually give us some coverage. Like, let's support him. And people always messaging me and asking me, well, do you know what's happening to this fighter and what's happening? I've suddenly become that gateway into that Eastern European side of the world. So it's always interesting for me. I happily answer questions about it. I happily talk about it because it's not easy to understand that region. I've spent a few years now visiting and figuring it out, so I happily spread that knowledge.
There is exactly. There's a lot of politics to it as well in MMA, the MMA scene over there as well, like you said before. And
indeed,
it is something that it takes time. It takes time connecting all the dots together with finding out how it all works. And you were a gateway for me. I started following you on Twitter, and that was it. Really, I just kept keeping an eye on what you do all the time, and I'm like, is he dyslexic? What name is that? And I'm thinking, hang on a minute, it's an actual fighter, and you just sit there and you think, wow, okay, then and you go onto YouTube, and all of a sudden it pops up, and you think, yeah, that guy's badass, and it's fantastic, and that's what I love. Yes, social media is a bit of a virus at times, but at other times it's yin and yang. For me, it's been great, and like you say, you're helping that kind of Russian kind of fan base with that kind of crossover, and I love it. It's a beautiful thing, and you're getting you end up doing commentary from it for yourself as well. It's opened up kind of gateways that you probably didn't plan, so to speak.
If you had once told me that I'd be going back and forth to Russia and making friends and meeting new people and new fighters and drinking tea with Vadim Finkelstein and commentating with Ian Freeman, I would have told you you're a damn fool. That's the way the world works, and it goes to show that you're only as interesting and you're only as adventurous as the amount of times you say yes in life, and I believe in that very, very much. And I think that's all it really takes is you give it an opportunity, you say yes, no matter how weird or how odd it seems, and you never know what comes from it. And that's pretty much the best advice I can give anyone.
Look, and before I let you go, I've got to ask, how do people connect with you on Twitter? So what are all the links that people can jump onto to read your, the stuff that you've been doing with Russia and everything, really? Just put them all out there.
Following me on Twitter will certainly keep you informed of my general ongoings, where I'm going to be, what I'm watching at the moment, who I'm following, certain tidbits. I love dropping tidbits of knowledge about Russia and about the fighters and who's going to be fighting on what card coming up and whose manager's doing what. And that's usually what I reserve Twitter for, basically, things that I'm not going to be writing articles about. But if it comes to articles, I prefer everyone check out my long forms. Those are the things that take the absolute longest to write. They all go on BloodyElbow.com. I've had 4 of them so far. Each one is over 6,000 words long, and each one dealing with a story that I find very close to my heart, each one of them. And I've got one coming up very soon as well. But that's pretty much my favorite work, and that's what I enjoy, people reading that and coming back and giving me all sorts of feedback, whether it be good or bad, or things I can improve or things I can change. That's my favorite thing to hear from people, basically. But in general, you can find all my work on Bloody Elbow, or if you're interested in more sports coverage in general, whether it be a FIFA scandal, whether it be some golf or tennis or whatnot, the rest you can all find on sportsonearth.com.
There, jump on it, get on your laptops, your phones, whatever. If you don't already follow Bloody Elbow, I will give you a bloody nose with my elbow. It blows my mind if you're not, folks. I love the site, love the work you guys are putting out. Honestly, this has been fantastic listening to you. I literally been smiling the whole time because it's just great information. And for me, I just love learning something new about the sport. You know, you can never get enough information, I find, and I'll keep learning all the time. I'm loving this.
Well, it's my pleasure, John. It's always good to connect with new people and share and spread different knowledge and converse about different things and debate topics in MMA. We all love this sport. We're all in this for good reasons, and some of us will just have a little more trouble making friends than others, it seems.
Yeah, we will. Hey, look, thank you again for your time. It's been fantastic, honestly.
My pleasure, John. Take care.